On May 13, 2026, Kelvin Walsh was confirmed by the United States Senate as the new chairman of the Federal Reserve for a 4-year term. Just one day earlier, he was also confirmed as a Federal Reserve governor for a 14-year term. He is replacing Jerome Powell, who has led the Fed since 2018, after first being nominated by Donald Trump and later reappointed by Joe Biden. Now, this transition is not happening during normal times. Walsh is walking into an economy dealing with inflation, political pressure, massive government debt, global instability, tariff wars, and a financial system that is become deeply dependent on central bank intervention. And the biggest question now is this: what happens to the US dollar under Kevin Walsh? Does the dollar stabilize? Does it become stronger? Will interest rates stay high? Will Trump pressure Walsh the same way he pressured Powell? And what does all of this mean for stocks, crypto, trade, and the global economy? Today, we are going to break all of this down in simple language. Even if you know nothing about the Federal Reserve, by the end of this video, you should fully understand what the Fed actually does, why interest rates matter, what quantitative easing is, why inflation exploded in 2022, why Kevin Walsh matters, why Trump and Walsh may eventually clash, and what the future of the dollar could look like from here. This is the Tomorrow Money Show, and I am your host, as always, Munyaradzi Togarepi, the Crypto Czar. Let's begin. First, before we talk about Kevin Walsh, we need to understand what the Federal Reserve actually is. The Federal Reserve, usually just called the Fed, is the central bank of the United States. A central bank is basically the institution responsible for managing a country's money system. Think of the Fed as the manager of the US financial engine. It controls the flow of money in the economy. It supervises banks. It tries to keep inflation under control. It tries to prevent economic collapse during crisis. If you are in Zimbabwe, this is what the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, or RBZ, does. In the US, it's called the Fed. Now, one important thing you have to know is the Fed is not supposed to work directly for the president. Technically, it is designed to be independent. That means the president cannot simply wake up and order the Fed to cut interest rates. That independence is extremely important, because if politicians directly control money printing and interest rates, they would almost always choose short-term political popularity over long-term economic stability. Politicians usually want cheap money because it makes the economy feel good quickly. But central banks are supposed to think long term. If you are in Zimbabwe, again, you would agree with me that the reason why much of the 6 currencies we had since independence failed is because of intervention by politicians into what the RBZ should do. Like in 2008, when then President Mugabe ordered the then Governor Gono to turn on the printers and print as many zeros as possible. In the US, the Fed does try to keep its independence, but conflicts between president and Fed chairs happen so often. Let's talk about the Fed's main job. The Federal Reserve is what is called a dual mandate. That sounds complicated, but it really just means the Fed has two main major goals. Number one, maximum employment. In simple language, the Fed wants as many people as possible to have jobs. Number two, price stability. That means keeping inflation under control. Inflation simply means prices are rising over time. And if inflation becomes too high, your money loses value. You can buy less food, less fuel, less housing, and fewer goods with the same amount of money. These two goals can sometimes conflict with each other, and I'm going to explain why. But before I do that, I want you to remember that principle in economics of supply and demand, specifically as it relates to prices of goods. When there's too much money in the economy circulating, that usually means there is too much demand for goods. And that high demand will result in the prices of those goods going up. And when prices of goods go up, that's inflation. When there's less money circulating in the economy, that means demand for goods reduces, which might not reduce the price of goods, but might be able to stabilize them. So you see, when the Fed wants to control inflation, it just has to control the amount of money circulating in the economy. If inflation is going up, the Fed just has to reduce the money in circulation. How does it do this? It does this through interest rates. Interest rates are basically the cost of borrowing money. When the rates are low, borrowing becomes cheap, and a lot of people will start borrowing the money to buy cars or build houses. Businesses start taking loans and hiring new employees, fulfilling the Fed's first mandate of maximum employment. Wages start to go up because the money is there. But you see, the more this happens, the more the money circulating in circulation increases. And if there's too much money in circulation, inflation will start to rise. In summary, low interest rates will create jobs, but they will also cause a rise in inflation. Now, when interest rates are high, borrowing is expensive and people will not bother borrowing unless it's really necessary. For example, here in Zimbabwe, uh, we have minimum annual rates of 35%, and at the bank's rates are as high as 100% annually for micro loans, which is why many Zimbabweans do not borrow. High rates will also cause businesses to slow down their borrowing, and this usually means they slow down hiring new people and salaries might start to fall. What this means is there is less money circulating in the economy, which results in inflation going down, but at the same time, unemployment will start to rise. I hope you can see how the Fed's job is hard. They cannot provide for maximum employment without causing inflation to go up, and they cannot lower inflation without causing unemployment. So, to handle this problem, they do their job on balance, i.e., they manage one problem at a time. If inflation is going up, they deal with it. And if unemployment is increasing faster, they, they deal with the unemployment. But the Fed governors don't always agree on what is more important between inflation and unemployment. And this is where you hear terms like hawks and doves. A hawk is someone who cares more about controlling inflation. Hence, hawks usually support higher interest rates. They believe inflation is extremely dangerous and the Fed should focus on that more. On the other hand, a dove is someone who cares more about employment, and doves usually support lower interest rates. The new Fed chairman, Kevin Walsh, is generally considered an inflation hawk. Uh, this means he is willing to do anything to keep inflation low, even hiking interest rates. That is extremely important for understanding um, what might happen next. To keep this, you have to keep this in mind. To understand Kevin Walsh, understand Kevin Walsh's thinking, we have to go back to 2008 during the U.S. Housing market collapse, where banks were failing and the financial system was close to break. Credit markets froze, people lost jobs, homes, and savings. And during that crisis, inflation fell drastically with unemployment rising. And the Fed did cut rates to 0%, but that didn't solve the problem. There was simply no money to be borrowed as banks were collapsing. So the Fed came up with something smart called quantitative easing, usually called QE. This was considered an emergency tool, something that should only be used during extreme crisis situations. Kevin Walsh himself was actually inside the Fed system during that era and witnessed the birth of QE firsthand. So, what exactly is QE? Let's explain this very carefully because this is where many people get confused. Quantitative easing is basically when the Federal Reserve creates new money electronically and uses that money to buy financial assets, mostly government bonds. Now, let's try to simplify that even more. The government has one way of getting money, which is through taxes. But imagine if the government wants to spend more money than it is collecting through taxes. To do that, it has to borrow money through issuing treasury bonds. They are called treasury bonds because they are issued by the treasury or the Ministry of Finance here in Zimbabwe. There is a difference between the treasury or the Ministry of Finance and the central bank, that is the Fed or RBZ in Zimbabwe. These are two totally different institutions. In a normal situation, private investors are the ones that buy treasury bonds, right? But under quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve just prints money electronically, of course, and goes to buy those bonds. They buy the bonds massively, which increases liquidity in the financial markets, with a lot of money now starting to flow in the economy. And with more money in circulation, employment will start to increase and the economy will improve. To be fair, many economists argue that quantitative easing helped prevent a depression in 2008. Uh, but here is the key point. A key point. QE was originally sold as a temporary emergency tool, like a fire extinguisher, something you use only during extreme danger. But over time, governments and markets became addicted to it. They realized that quantitative easing can be used as an infinite money glitch, and that is exactly where Kevin Wash's criticism of QE begins. After the 2008 crisis, something changed permanently in global finance. Markets started depending on central banks for bailouts. Whenever markets crashed, investors expected the Fed to intervene by printing money. Whenever growth slowed, investors expected rate cuts. This became known as the Fed put, meaning investors believed the Fed would rescue markets. Interest rates stayed historically low for years. The Fed's balance sheet became enormous. Remember, the Fed buys treasury bonds when it's doing quantitative easing, and treasury bonds are assets. And as you know, assets have to be recorded on the balance sheet for those who did accounting. The more the quantitative easing, the more the bonds being bought, and the more the treasury bonds, the bigger the Fed's balance sheet. This was not just happening in America. Central banks around the world were doing similar things. Cheap money became normal, and that laid the foundation for future inflation problems. Then came 2020, the COVID crisis, with the massive lockdowns that caused massive unemployment as everyone was forced to stay at home during lockdowns. Everyone looked to their governments for a solution. And again, the Fed tried to cut rates aggressively, but that wasn't enough as the economy was totally closed. In America, stimulus checks had to be sent to the citizens who were at home and with no income. Where do you think the US government got that money? Of course, through quantitative easing. And the Fed was now a pro at doing this. The Fed balance sheet expanded even more dramatically. And this is where criticism intensified. Because many people, including Kevin Warsh, argue that the emergency response may have gone too far and lasted too long. President Biden even used the money from quantitative easing to fund his Build Back Better plan. Now, to be fair, policy makers were dealing with panic and uncertainty, but the result was a massive amount of money injected into the economy. By 2022, after lockdowns had ended, with those massive amounts of money and near zero interest rates, inflation surged to levels Americans had not seen in decades. Food prices rose, fuel prices rose as Russia invaded Ukraine, housing costs rose, everything became more expensive. My boy Jerome Powell sprang into action. He began raising interest rates to slow down borrowing, to slow down the money in circulation. This was the fastest tightening cycle in many years. Eventually, the inflation started going down. But before it could reach normal levels of 2%, the Biden administration went out of office through Kamala Harris's 2024 disappointing defeat by Daddy Trump in the presidential election of that year. But Daddy Trump is a dove. He wanted to bring back America to its glory with massive employment. He wanted to make America great again. That's where the problem was, or is. To get the massive employment, you need the rates to be near zero. You need interest rates at zero. But my boy Powell was too reluctant to cut the rates, saying that inflation risk was still high. Donald Trump repeatedly attacked Jerome Powell for not cutting the rate faster. He called him names like too late Powell, and to some extent, Powell was right, because Trump, through Liberation Day, introduced massive tariffs which were expected to increase the cost of all goods imported into America, which is another form of inflation. Then came then came the conflict with Iran and disruptions around the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important oil shipping routes, and if that area becomes unstable, oil prices will surge as they did. And when oil prices rise sharply, inflation pressures increase globally, making it hard to cut rates. So Powell argued that cutting rates too early could reignite inflation. But Powell's term will end today on 15 May, which is why Trump nominated Warsh, who is now the Fed chair. Kevin Warsh is entering office at a very difficult moment. Latest inflation data is reportedly showing inflation rising again at 3.8%. That is still above the Fed's target inflation of 2%. Now, inflation is rising again. Traditional hawkish thinking would suggest not cutting rates, or even go further to hike rates, which is against Trump's wishes. This puts Walsh directly in the middle of economics and politics. Oh, and here's another important thing. The Fed chair is powerful, but he is not a king who decides policy on his own. The Federal Open Market Committee votes on monetary policy. That means Walsh cannot simply do whatever he wants. Other governors vote too. And yes, Jerome Powell is reportedly expected to remain on the board as a governor. Even though Powell is no longer chair, his influence may still exist inside the institution. So, what is the future of the US dollar under Kevin Walsh? For years, many people believed endless quantitative easing and massive debt spending would weaken the dollar over time. And to some extent, the dollar has faced long-term concerns because investors worry about debt levels and money creation. But Kevin Walsh represents something different. He has consistently argued that the Fed became too involved in the economy. Walsh appears to believe the Fed should return to a more limited role. If he truly follows that philosophy, several things could happen. First, the Fed balance sheet could shrink more aggressively over time. Second, interest rates may stay higher than markets expect. Third, the era of easy money could become less common. And fourth, the dollar could stabilize or even strengthen because stronger monetary discipline usually supports currency value. When investors believe a central bank is serious about inflation, confidence in the currency can improve. That does not mean the dollar will suddenly explode upward tomorrow. There are still enormous US debt problems, political pressures, and geopolitical risks. But compared to the ultra loose money era, Walsh could represent a major shift. Here is my prediction. The good relationship between Trump and Walsh probably does not last forever. And the reason is simple. Politics and central banking will eventually collide. Trump wants very low interest rates, but Walsh's intellectual framework appears much more focused on long-term monetary discipline. The economic data might even force him to hike rates, throwing the Fed yet again at political pressure for as long as Trump is president. So, where does all of this leave us? We may be entering a completely new monetary era. The post 2008 world was dominated by cheap money and quantitative easing. Kelvin Walsh may represent an attempt to reverse some of that mindset. And if that happens, the implications are enormous for the dollar. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to the Tomorrow Money Show for deep dives into finance, macroeconomics, crypto, and the future of money. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.